Moving on from elephants, we're going to talk about the hyraxes. Hyraxes are these really sort of odd group of animals that are in northern Africa, Asia Minor, the Middle East. These are, in scripture, they're referred to as rock badgers, um, depending which version or edition that you're looking at, the translation you're looking at. Sometimes they're called rock badgers, sometimes they're called conies, sometimes they're called hyraxes. But they're specifically mentioned in Old Testament twice, talking about animals that are clean and unclean to eat. These are small. These are about the size of a groundhog or smaller than a groundhog, but they're closely related to elephants and they're closely related to manatees molecularly, and because of those other characteristics we talked about with hindgut fermentation, the lack of a clavicle, and the type of nails that they have. So there's 5 species of hyraxes, again in Africa and Asia Minor in the Middle East. These are also a gregarious animal in that they live in colonies. They're all herbivores and they're hindgut fermenters. So again, these have a cecum, kind of like a rabbit. So this is something that sometimes people point out in scripture. And scripture says that the hyrax chews its cud, but it doesn't have a hoof, so therefore it's unclean. Well, they don't really chew their cud. They're a hindgut fermenter, just like a rabbit. They kind of grind their teeth when they're stressed, but they don't necessarily chew their cud. But they don't have hooves, so under Mosaic law, they would be considered an unclean animal. The teeth on these things are really odd looking. So if you look at this image here, it has sort of a goofy looking tooth. The way that I describe it is if you're drawing a picture of a bat as a child and you're like trying to draw the teeth on a bat, you would draw these little triangle teeth. That's essentially what these guys have. So on elephants, the incisors make the tusk. On hyraxes, the incisors are also modified to these kind of almost tusky type of teeth. They look kind of like fangs, but they're more like a tusk. The last group we're going to talk about here relatively quickly is the Sirenia. These are the manatees, the dugongs, and the sea cow. These we do have in the United States and the southeast United States. These animals also have a tie to mythology and Greek mythology. This is where the myth of mermaids comes from. So if in the writings of Homer, which are some of our earliest Greek writings, they talk about mermaids and they call them sirens or sirens. That's where this name comes from. Sirenia comes from the link that they have with that mermaid myth. So if you were to see these from a long distance, you can sort of imagine how they might have a human type of shape. They certainly don't look like the Little Mermaid, but in the um, early descriptions of mermaids and mer people, um, they were not necessarily looking like the Little Mermaid either. So this is where that myth comes from. So right now there's 2 different groups. There's the dugong and the manatees. And the other one that's worth mentioning is the Steller sea cow. The Steller sea cow is like a really large version of these that went extinct about 250 years ago. These lived off of the Bering Sea, off of Alaska. They were huge animals that weighed several tons. And as Europeans went into that part of the world, these were very vulnerable to overharvest, and unfortunately, they were harvested to extinction in a period of about 30 years after their discovery. So it didn't take long for people to wipe out the Steller sea cow, unfortunately. Here's an image of the relative size of these. The one that we might be most familiar with are the West Indian manatees. These are the ones that are off of the coast of Florida. Those would be sort of the largest of the manatees, and the manatees are larger than the dugongs. The Steller sea cow, as you can see, is much larger than any of those. So it was It was like 3 times the size of the largest manatee that you'd find off of Florida. Dugongs are found um, in the Old World. These are off of the coast of Africa and found throughout Indonesia, off the coast of Australia. They also live in the Red Sea. These are essentially manatees that live in the Old World. They're primarily in salt water, though. Manatees are more of a can tolerate brackish water and even go into fresh water. There's some that go into the Amazon River. Dugons are a saltwater species and are found in the Old World. So the main difference between the two is that the dugons are saltwater species. The dugong has a snout that's sort of angled down, and this is different than we have in the manatees. If you look at the teeth of a dugong, they're shaped a little different too. So the snout has a sharp angle down. They do have a couple large incisors. The other teeth, though, are essentially non-existent. There's the alveoli, the sockets, and that's about it. So they have these sort of plates that are in their mouth that allow them to chew these soft sea grasses. Um, but so their skulls are pretty unique. And if you had a manatee and you had a dugong next to each other, you'd be able to tell the two apart by the angle of the snout and then the presence or absence of the teeth. So some of the adaptations that these have, the teeth, since they essentially don't have teeth on the dugong, they have these sort of leathery pads in their mouth that allow them to eat vegetation. These are big animals, so they don't thermoregulate very well at all. So having a large body size helps with that. Also limits them to just a very small area where they can live where the water temperatures are right. They have very dense bones. So most mammals, you have marrow that's producing red blood cells. And in these animals, there's very little marrow. The bones are really, really dense, and that helps them to just stay submerged. They are not particularly strong swimmers, so they need to be able to stay submerged, and having heavy bones allows them to do that. They have some limitations as well. So they um, the water depth is limiting for them. They eat vegetation, so they need to stay within a photosynthetic zone. They can't go very deep at all because very quickly you lose vegetation. So they're staying in shallow waters because of that. They're not a particularly strong swimmer, so areas of strong current can actually limit where they can go. They're vulnerable to predators. Larger predators like large sharks can eat them. And they have pretty slow reproduction. They don't reproduce until late in life. They only have a few young throughout their life, so they're very slow to reproduce themselves. Manatees are very similar. Manatees are found in the New World. They're found in South America. Some of them go into the Amazon River. And in the United States, they're found along the Gulf of Mexico from around New Orleans going east. And they go along the coast. Florida and the Carolinas would be where most of them are, but occasionally they wander pretty far north. So they've been found in the Hudson River in New York. They've been found in Rhode Island, but they primarily stay in those warmer areas. You could see that the face or the snout is shaped a little bit different on a manatee versus a dugong. If you look at the skull, here's an image of the skull of both of those. The top one, Tridecidae, is the manatee, and they actually have teeth, and the rostrum or the snout isn't angulated down. So again, if you just had the skull and you didn't know if it was a dugong or if it was a manatee, that would be one way you'd be able to tell the two apart, is whether it has teeth and whether that rostrum or snout is angled down. So that would probably make a pretty good exam question at some point. Manatees, just like dugongs, are limited to shallow waters because they eat vegetation that requires photosynthesis. They are a lot more tolerant of fresh water. Um, they do very well in those areas, which are also the areas that people like to be. Warm waters, shallow waters, that makes them vulnerable to boat strikes. So unfortunately, manatees are not particularly savvy of boats, and they don't move very quick because they're not a very strong swimmer. And despite their large size, they're just sort of this gray blob in the water. So often people don't see them, which makes them vulnerable to being hit by boats and boat propellers. So right now, a serious conservation issue for this species is dealing with boat injuries due to propellers. So with that, we're going to stop for today. That's just very quickly touching on these species. I would look at your book and read a little bit more about them. It's a relatively short chapter. Um, these are species that you may not ever encounter in your professional life, but they're species you might be asked about just through popular culture. And for example, VeggieTales. There's a song in VeggieTales about a manatee, Barbara manatee, and some of you may be familiar with that. All right, I'm going to quit for today. Hopefully I'll see you on Monday. Thank you. Have a good weekend.